Good to be together this morning. I want to focus our attention on this extraordinary moment in the life of Jesus. It's amazing how when we look at the Scripture and we look at the will of God and we look at the things that we know God clearly defines for us, we typically describe these things as being black and white. They're easy to see. They're easy to discern. We're either doing that or we're not. And this instance in the life of Jesus, I think, gives us a broader picture of really the human interaction with that. That yes, we recognize that God's will is black and white, and God's commandments and God's instructions and the direction God wants for us, and we know that there are blessings and there are curses, there are rewards, there are punishments. But in this moment, I believe we get to see a window where even Jesus himself demonstrates that the human condition is much more complex and much more involved than just a matter of, do I do it or do I not do it? There was an actual wrestling match that Jesus endures here. And in that wrestling match, there is an avenue of trust in God that he demonstrates. I want us to look at, and it goes back to something that clearly has always been discussed and demonstrated over and over from the Old Testament to the New Testament, that God can provide all that we need, and in many ways above and beyond what we need, if we simply trust him, have faith in him, and continue to put our desires in his hands. And we're going to look at this in a specific way. And one thing that he says, if you were very quickly turn to Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12, I want to notice how anytime we look at prayer, we look at the avenue of prayer. And that's what we're going to look specifically here. Jesus demonstrating that whenever we find ourselves in that moment where we know black and white, we know right and wrong, and we know what God would have us to do, and we know the consequences of not doing what God wants us to do, and we find ourselves in that human condition, the struggle of what even Jesus himself recognized there. We're going to look at another passage. He says, I know that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Especially that's a time for us to pray, a time for us to truly have faith in what prayer offers. And we're going to look here in Acts chapter 12. We see an avenue of prayer. Acts chapter 12, beginning in verse 11. It says, when Peter came to himself, he said, now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. They said to her, you are out of your mind. But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying it is his angel. But Peter continued knocking. And when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed, but motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James and the brethren. Then he left and went to another place. Amongst the struggles we have, amongst the issues we have, whether it is struggling to do God's will or struggling against the weakness of the flesh, one weakness we must strive to overcome is the weakness of weak faith. Even in moments where the flesh is weak, we can trust that if our faith continues to go above even our own physical weaknesses, that's how we're going to find ourselves through that path and through that opening that the Lord provides a way of escape. In other words, one thing we must always strive to keep building and strengthening and depending on is our faith, even amidst our physical weaknesses. And here's an amazing example of this, that here Peter was physically held in custody. Certainly the writing was on the wall, seeming that he was about to be killed just as James prior to his release James was killed by the sword. And here Peter's about to be killed. And notice it says that the disciples met in a house and they were praying for him. But when Peter shows up at the house, they don't believe that their prayer was answered. It's almost as if we just pray because that's what you do. We just got together because, that's what you do when people are sick. That's what you do when people are in trouble. You just get together and you pray. We really didn't believe that you were going to be saved. They clearly didn't, because every time the little girl said, guess what? Who's knocking at the door? No, it's not. No, and if it is Peter, it must be his spirit, because he's long gone by now. Clearly, they've killed him. Isn't that interesting? They lacked faith in the very instrument that's able to help us when our physical strength is gone, when physical ability is not there. Faith is what allows us to counter that. And it's amazing. It says in verse 18, now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him, they had not found him. He examined the guards in order that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. Not only was he escaped, but he's perfectly fine, and he continues to go on his way preaching. One of the things I think this keys in is it matters not how loud our voices or how many hours we spend in prayer to tune God's ear to our petitions. God hears faith. God hears faith. And he mentions it so many times how it is faith is what we need to develop, and we need to build a steady dependency on faith, especially when we need to go to God in prayer. They're in James chapter 1. James chapter 1, notice in verse 5, he says, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Notice verse 7. He says, for that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord. I found that interesting. You know, the people who were praying for Peter, they didn't expect to receive anything from the Lord, did they? They didn't. They didn't expect Peter to be standing there at the door. They didn't expect it to be his voice. And as he says, that's the consequence of lack of faith. Don't expect. Contrast that, though. What's the opposite? If I have faith, shouldn't that build my hope, because I can have an expectation? Whereas God wants us to pray with a certain expectancy. I believe especially when we're in a position where we don't know what else to do, we don't know where else to go, we don't trust ourselves, but we can trust God and should expect. And that expectancy leads us to waiting. And that waiting leads to having a perseverant attitude. That's what he's talking about here in James, that, in other words, we give up too quickly. We will end up making a decision that we will regret because we didn't depend on faith to override what it is that we were weak or struggling with. There, in Luke chapter 18, a passage here, strengthening our faith. Luke chapter 18, beginning in verse 6, it says, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now, will not God bring about justice for his elect who cried him day and night, and will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, notice the question, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Whereas there's no doubt our desire, there's no doubt the dire nature of our situations, but the question is, even in a persistency to call upon God, will there be faith? Will there be an expectancy? Will there be a trust? And this was the case with Jesus' prayer. What makes this prayer so encouraging is the act of faith. Remember in Hebrews chapter 5, it actually says that God heard Jesus' prayer and tells us why he heard the prayer. Hebrews chapter 5. I'm going to look at a couple passages here. Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 7. It says, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Notice that the passage I want to focus on there is in verse 7. Notice it says that although he was a son, he learned obedience. In other words, it wasn't simply his unique position. It wasn't that, well, I can count on God hearing me because after all, I'm his son. There was something else. In other words, he didn't just utilize the position and take for granted that, yes, obviously, the unique relationship they had. But Jesus had to demonstrate something that God calls on all of us to demonstrate, that he also will hear our prayers or tune to them or help us see how he responds to them. And it says it was because of his piety. This is describing a deep overriding confidence, an unshattered trust that God is in control. And because God is in control, I can appeal to him when I feel like things around me aren't in control. It says he was heard because of this. His unique position of honoring God's control and sovereignty over this. It says he gave it with loud crying and tears to the one, notice, able to save him from death. That's why he was heard, because of his piety, because of his humility, his overall in awe and reverence of a God who is able. That's the key. That Jesus, when he went to the Lord, it wasn't just, well, here's my venting partner. Here, just hear me out. I just need to get this out of my system. That's not what was happening at all. Yes, he was in this position where the weight was bearing down on him, but notice it says God actually heard the very plea he made, because it was a prayer designated on God. Help me, save me, deliver me. And make no mistake, even though he was not delivered, the key is God heard the prayer, noted the prayer, and Jesus was trusting that he would. And I want us to look at something that I find very fascinating and amazing about this. Because what he's asking for, he's asking essentially for deliverance. And just a couple of things to note. One, we note his intensity. It says he fell on his face. There was a great intensity here. Matthew chapter 26 describes the physical position Jesus goes into. We know that this was a desperate plea. It was one in which he is putting all of his faith and all of his strength in God's hands at this moment. Because in Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 36, it says, Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. And he said to them, My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. There was an intensity in this. And I would say the intensity is focused on the one who could help. That's why it is so intense. It is so intense because he realized, I cannot help myself. You can. And I literally am putting myself completely in your hands. He has prostrated himself almost in a position of saying, I'm no longer in control. I find that amazing. Jesus, who can control the sea, who can control sickness and death, is demonstrating what we do when we no longer have control. He was in a place where he had no control. And he's crying. It says loud crying. Which this is the kind of crying that if you were at a distance, you would hear somebody in such a position. What's wrong? What's going on? You ever heard someone crying so loudly? Maybe they're in another room. Maybe down the hall. And the crying, even though you can't see the person, indicates they're in a great place of distress. That's audibly what the disciples were hearing. As it says in Hebrews chapter 5 verse 7, with loud crying and tears. And of course in Luke chapter 22 describes the physical intensity, that physically it says his sweat became like great drops of blood. In Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 41, it says, and he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him, and being in agony, he was praying very fervently. And his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow, and said to them, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray, that you may not enter in temptation. I want to key in. Why does he say, why are you sleeping? Because they're in a position of rest. Why does he indicate that? Because the type of praying he's referring to is the complete opposite of a restful kind of prayer. We're not talking about the kind of prayer where it is just to comfort me before I... In other words, there needs to be some intensity here. I'm intense right now. I'm in a position where I'm demonstrating I'm not in control. And the only one who can lead me out of this is the Father. I'm giving himself complete in him. And guess what? You all are in the same boat. Why are you sleeping? Why are you in a restful state of mind? The kind of prayer that you need to lead you out of temptation is this kind of prayer. But why do we sometimes fail to go that route? I believe it is because we struggle with the faith part. You mean God is able? Yes, able to do what? 1 Corinthians 10:13. With every temptation, he provides the way of escape, that we might be able to endure it. He provides a way that we don't have to give in. And I'll be honest, the times when I have found myself giving in, I kick myself, not only because of, yes, it's sin, but because I look at this passage and think, why do I not give myself to this kind of prayer? And that's what he's teaching us to do. That's why he's in this position, because I'm not in control. I'm giving myself to the one who can deliver me. Why are you sleeping? You going to deliver yourself, Peter? You need to rely upon God. Realize the state you're in. He had an urgency. His urgency, he pleaded with the Father 3 times to keep him from drinking the cup of suffering. In Matthew chapter 26, very quickly, Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 39. Matthew 26, 39. Notice he says, it is a threefold request. He went a little beyond them and fell on his face praying, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour. Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. What do we do when the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak? We keep praying. Because we need to have the faith that we need to stay in prayer the entire duration. Keep watching. Keep praying. Don't underestimate the weakness, and don't underestimate the vulnerable position you're in. You need to stay in prayer. And this watchfulness is watching for the Father that you're pleading with. Watch for his deliverance. Watch for the way he's going to answer this. So verse 42, and he continues. He went away again a second time. And he's continuing. He's telling them to do what he's done. I'm continuing in this state of prayer. My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. In other words, the prayer has been answered. Keep praying until the prayer is answered. Don't stop. And his understanding that merely just wishing it away or having a desire wasn't enough. It was, I have to trust what God's will is. God has an answer, and God is going to deliver, and God is going to provide this deliverance. We just have to trust, and we have to stay alert, and we have to keep in this mindset of waiting for him and pleading and resting upon him. But what is interesting is what Jesus is actually asking for. If we break it down, because I've always struggled with this and wrestled with this. Jesus is saying, let this cup, in other words, this avenue of suffering, all that's going to happen on the cross, he says, don't let that happen. But everything in prophecy says it has to happen. Everything in prophecy says it has to. These are all the prophecies related to what's about to happen. He's going to be betrayed by his own familiar friend for 30 pieces of silver. His disciples are going to abandon him. He's going to remain silent during the trial filled with false witnesses. He's going to be mocked, spit upon, his hands and feet pierced, crucified between two thieves. On and on and on it goes. Think about this. Everything has already been solidified in Scripture. Prophecy. We know how Jesus views prophecy. Jesus believes that prophecy is what leads us to having faith in God. Jesus constantly, to help people understand, I have to be the Messiah because I've proven and I've fulfilled prophecy. So why is he asking God to deliver him in a way that would go against fulfilled prophecy? Well, there's a passage that answers this, and it's in Mark. In Mark chapter 14. And it's amazing. Mark chapter 14, this is how Jesus reconciles this. Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 35, it says, and he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. And he was saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Did you catch what he says? All things are possible. I have no idea how God reconciles all of these prophecies and delivers Jesus, but yet still allows them to be fulfilled. I don't know how, but Jesus believed it could. Because there's no way he's asking for a deliverance that would somehow get people to doubt God. There's no way he would ask that. But he is in a situation where he feels the weight of suffering, and his plea is that, Lord, I'm in a vulnerable position, and I simply am asking, if it's possible, would you deliver me? And what I love about the example of this prayer is his faith. He believes that God can do it. The question is that his will? And that's a great example and a great rebuke to me. Because of all the times maybe I find myself in where maybe the temptation is so strong and I feel that the inevitability of giving into it is right. Well, what's the point in praying now? Because God, what's going to do? Reverse all these things, reverse all these actions have already taken place? We think too much. I think it's the problem. We think too much. We almost think ourselves out of just saying, I don't know how God's going to do it. All I know is I need him to do it, and I can't do this myself. Lord, if it be your will, rescue me, deliver me. And in this case, in this particular case, His will was not to deliver him in that fashion, but that's the only reason it didn't come to pass, was because it was not his will. When it came to ability, Jesus had all faith. And I love that. In verse 36 of Mark chapter 14, he says, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. But I will rest in whatever answer. I will accept it, whatever you decide your will is. So the question is God hearing our faith? We need faith, because it is our unbelief and our wavering faith that trips us up most of the time. It is our faith that needs to carry us through. In fact, turn over to Hebrews chapter 12, and he reminds us of the sin that so easily entangles us. There in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, he says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. How? He says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author, notice, and perfecter of faith. And I believe this instant in his prayer is a great illustration of what the Hebrew writer is encouraging us to look to. Let Jesus' amazing confidence and trust and faith in God's ability. And it was. How much so? So much so that he falls upon the ground. He's basically surrendering. He's surrendering. He's saying, I'm no longer going to do this on my own. I'm to the point of crying, to the point of loud crying and tears, sweat pouring down to me. In other words, the intensity of basically saying that, God, I need you. I need you to come to me at this hour. And in verse 3, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3 says, for consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that ye will not grow weary and lose heart. Let us not grow weary and lose heart. Keep in mind the very reason you are asking God is because no one on earth has the ability to do anything about your problem. There's no one else who can fix this. There's no one else who can lead us. There's no one else who can protect us. And so as we build a dependency on God, I find this example of Jesus to be so encouraging that in his lowest moment, where he felt the least in control, it was his faith in God that led him to cry out, Lord, let this cup pass from me. And in so doing, was trying to demonstrate that to the disciples with their very temptations. Say, pray with me. Fall on your knees. Fall upon your face. Yes, give yourself completely to a dependency and earnestness that you cannot get out of this on your own. And you're going to have to wait on God and look for that answer and must believe, yes, it is possible. He can deliver you. In other words, I don't know how God would have delivered Peter out of that situation where he's warming himself by the fire and all these people are putting all the pressure on him and he has all the fear and all the anxiety of watching what's happening to Jesus and questioning, am I going to follow him or not? One thing I do know, but Jesus was indicating that God could have let him out of that. It didn't have to happen the way it did with Peter. God could have provided the way of escape if instead of giving himself to sleep, he would have prayed, Father, let this pass from me. Father, lead me. Father, I need you. And let us all realize that God is able. God is capable. The question is, do we have the confidence and the faith to put ourselves in a vulnerable position to let him show us how to get through it? One more passage I want to lead again to sum up, and all of this really is hopefully a practical way for us to see 1 Corinthians chapter 10 in verse 12. He says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Let's borrow the words of Jesus, and in that very prayer, yes, say it, all things are possible to you. If anyone's with us who's never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, we encourage you that you also would have that same confidence that all things are possible for the Lord. And that he is not only able to cleanse you, to forgive you, to wash you, make your soul clean, but he is able to transform you and make you a new person. To create within you a new heart. To lead you out of the tendency and the weaknesses of sin that has brought you to your present condition. And he is able to help you become someone who trusts in God, follows God, and can be safe with God. I want to read, finally, just a few verses. I love at the end of just a short book, one of the minor prophets in the book of Zephaniah. I just want to read the last few words. It's such hope for people who feel like they just don't know that they can possibly get out of their situation. But he says, in that day, it will be said to Jerusalem, do not be afraid, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. The Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. He will exult over you with joy. He will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. I will gather those who grieve about the appointed feast. They came from you, O Zion. The reproach of exile is a burden on them. Behold, I am going to deal at that time with all your oppressors. I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and I will turn their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. It doesn't matter if we think it's hopeless. God says it's possible. God says he will restore, he will forgive, he will renew. Once you put your faith and trust that God is able to do that through his son, Jesus Christ, that as he died and was buried and rose again, so you too, if you follow the tenets of the gospel, that if you believe and are baptized and can be buried to wash away all that is old and to be risen to walk in newness of life, you too can be renewed inside of God. Once you come and obey the gospel and be cleansed, be free, walk with him, and also have trust that he can save you continuously even from your temptations and from your weaknesses. And if any one of us has fallen back and needs to be renewed in faith, let you come and confess and seek prayer or help, however we may assist or help you. Won't you come to the front and obey the gospel while we stand and sing the psalm of encouragement together?